Philippa Foot, 1920 to 2010, was an important moral philosopher and an admirable human being. She was the author of important writings on moral philosophy over a period of 50 years, and in her own life she exemplified many of the virtues she wrote about and whose study she did so much to foster. I'll mostly talk about her work in philosophy, but at the end I'll say a bit about her as a person. First, Foot's life. She was born Philippa Bosanquet in 1910. Her father was an aristocratic Englishman who married an American, Esther Cleveland. Esther was the daughter of United States President Grover Cleveland. Before Donald Trump, Grover Cleveland, Philippa's grandfather, was the only US president to have 2 non-consecutive terms as president, and Philippa's mother was actually born in the White House. Philippa grew up in a rather grand house, now a local museum, in North Yorkshire. You might think that coming from such a privileged background, Philippa and her sister would have had a first-rate education, but you'd be wrong. As Foot later recalled, her parents were keen to see the girls ride horses, go hunting, and mix in aristocratic society, but they neglected the girls' education badly. A string of governesses were employed to teach them at home, most of them with no higher education at all. But one who had a degree recognised Philippa's ability and told her, "You know, you could go to university." So against her parents' expectations, Philippa worked hard, studied with a crammer, and gained admission to Somerville College, Oxford, to study PPE, politics, philosophy and economics, in 1939. Later, she had become a fellow and tutor in philosophy at Somerville College, where she taught for 20 years until moving to the US and teaching at various universities there. At the time Philippa studied at Oxford, there were some 30 colleges admitting men, but only 5 where women could study. At Somerville, 39 to 42 were her BA years, Philippa made lifelong friends with many women, including notably Iris Murdoch, the philosopher and novelist to whom she was close all her life. Another contemporary was Mary Scrutton, who became the distinguished philosopher Mary Midgley. At another of the women's colleges, St Hugh's, and 2 years ahead of Philippa, was Elizabeth Anscombe, who would become a world-famous philosopher. After the war, Anscombe too would be associated with Somerville as a philosophy researcher and part-time teacher. She and Philippa became firm friends as well as colleagues, and Philippa always credited Anscombe with being a huge influence on her philosophical thinking. As we'll see, Foot later played a supremely generous part in ensuring that Anscombe, at a difficult point in her career, could remain at Somerville and continue her work in philosophy. Now, these 4 women philosophers, Anscombe, Foot, Midgley and Murdoch, have recently been the subject of 2 excellent books, The Women Are Up to Something by Benjamin Lipscomb and Metaphysical Animals by Claire McCummell and Rachel Wiseman. The 4 have been named the Quartet of Women Philosophers, but Foot hated being known as a woman philosopher, and I doubt she would have warmed to the label quartet either. Back to wartime Oxford, which Philippa entered in 1939. In normal times, young men heavily outnumbered women students, and women as teachers were very few and far between. But in the war years, most of the young men, and very many of the teachers too, were serving in the armed forces or in other war work. Somerville didn't have a fellow in philosophy. Indeed, Philippa would be the first to fill that role from 1950 onwards. And she and many of her philosophy friends were taught by Donald Mackinnon, who later became a professor of theology. Mackinnon had been a pacifist, but horrified by the rise of Nazism, had volunteered to serve in the army, only to be excluded on health grounds. So he threw himself into teaching and inspired all manner of students with a love of philosophy. From religious believers, such as Anscombe and Murdoch, to Philippa Bosanquet, who declared herself to be a card-carrying atheist all her life. Mary Midgley would later note that because male students were now far fewer on the ground in Oxford, the young women students were able to speak, for instance at meetings of philosophical societies, and to be heard in ways that earlier hadn't been possible. Philippa got a first-class degree in PPE, but her love of philosophy had to be put on hold while she, like all her fellow graduates, did war work. She went to London to work at Chatham House and shared a flat with Iris Murdoch, whose exotic love life is well documented. When Iris cast off a former boyfriend, M.R.D. Foote, seducing Philippa's current lover in his place, Philippa and Michael Foote fell in love, became engaged, and, after Michael returned from being a prisoner of war, they married in 1945 and returned to Oxford. Henceforth, she was always Philippa Foote, Mrs. Foote, even after the marriage ended in divorce in 1960. She had no children, a matter of great sorrow to her, and she never remarried. As Mrs. Foote, she made her name as a philosopher in Oxford, teaching at her old college for 20 years. She bore a particularly heavy teaching load and played an important role in the governing of the college, led by the visionary Dame Janet Vaughan, of whom more later. In the 70s and 80s, she taught in the USA, latterly as Griffin Professor of Philosophy at the University of California, Los Angeles, before returning to Oxford in 1991. It was here that in 2001, when she'd turned 80, that she published the acclaimed monograph, Natural Goodness, the culmination of her life's work. So, moral philosophy in the 1940s and 50s. In her earliest and her latest publications, Foote had a single goal: to replace the dominant view in moral philosophy, subjectivism, with an account which allowed morality to have an objective foundation, but not a religious foundation. Rather, one founded on truths about the nature of human beings. During and after World War II, there was a growing consensus among moral philosophers, not all, but the most influential, as follows. The business of moral philosophy was the study of moral language, moral judgment such as stealing is wrong or you ought to keep your promises. Now the statement stealing is wrong looks like an ordinary claim about how the world is, like oak trees are deciduous or salt dissolves in water. But this is misleading, so the consensus held, and it needs to be understood differently, not as a description of how things are, not of a moral reality, because they held there is no moral reality. So how should such moral judgments be understood? A.J. Ayer, in his little book, Language, Truth and Logic, influenced by the Vienna Circle, had put forward the so-called emotive theory of ethics. This declared that despite their surface appearance, moral judgments do not state moral truths or falsehoods, because there are no moral truths to be stated. Rather, they express emotions. This emotive theory of ethics got the nickname the boo-hurrah theory because it analysed a statement such as stealing is wrong as something like boo to stealing. Subtler versions got developed. For instance, the American philosopher C.S. Stevenson, Ethics and Language, 1944, replaced Ayer's emotions with attitudes such as approval and disapproval. And in the late 40s and early 50s, the Oxford philosopher R.M. Hare, The Language of Morals, 1952, refined the theory further still, incorporating the idea that moral judgments are essentially prescriptive, prescribing or recommending a course of action to oneself and others. What these had in common, and what Foote went on to resist in all her work, was their subjectivism. All these theories about moral judgments made essential reference to the speaker's emotions or attitudes or prescriptions. And Foote felt in her bones that this was wrong. She searched through her work to show what was wrong with this moral subjectivism and to develop an account that found an objective basis for moral judgments. In later life, Foote told interviewers that her determination to find an alternative to subjectivist theories stemmed from the time, at the end of World War II, when news of the Nazi atrocities in Europe was coming out, the horrors of the concentration camps. She said, "This news was shattering in a fashion that no one now can easily understand. We had thought that something like this, the wholesale murder of millions of Jews, could not happen. This is what got me interested in moral philosophy in particular. In the face of the news of the camps, I thought, it can't just be the way that Stevenson, Ayer and Hare say that it is, that morality in the end is just the expression of an attitude, and the subject haunted me." Foote's early criticisms of subjectivism. In some articles written in the 1950s, Foote became well known for her lucid and convincing arguments against subjectivist theories, and in particular against the views of R.M. Hare. Hare was arguing that what makes a principle a moral principle was not its content, but its form. If someone sincerely urged that one ought to do such and such, if the person prescribed doing such and such to himself and others, then that was enough to make their statement a moral principle, provided it was both prescriptive and universal. Foote denied this. She argued that there must be some restriction on the content of the principle for it to count as a moral principle, and that ignoring this was offering a private enterprise theory of moral criteria. She wrote, "If someone happened to insist that no one should run round trees left-handed or look at hedgehogs in the light of the moon, this might count as a moral principle about which nothing more need be said." The same insistence on respecting content is found in her criticism of her opponent's views about the meaning of moral terms such as good, and their insistence on a dichotomy, an allegedly unbridgeable gap between facts and values, between descriptive meaning and evaluative meaning. To counter this, Foote highlighted what later came to be labelled thick moral concepts, concepts which have certain descriptive criteria, but which equally are evaluative terms. One of her favourite examples was that of rudeness. As she pointed out, calling some behaviour rude expresses at least mild disapproval. That is, it's an evaluative term. But equally, we can't label any old conduct of which we disapprove rude. If it's correct to say that a piece of behaviour is rude, then the behaviour must be such as to cause offence by indicating a lack of respect. It must satisfy some factual criteria. Now, these points may seem obvious, but they gave Foote a way of tying at least some evaluative terms to facts about human behaviour, something her opponents insisted could not be done. So we turn to virtues and vices. Attention to concepts such as rudeness also gave Foote the genesis of a project which she shared with her friend and colleague Elizabeth Anscombe, and indeed with Anscombe's husband, the philosopher Peter Geach. The project was that of giving pride of place in moral philosophy to a study of the human virtues and vices, vices such as rudeness, but also more important ones such as cruelty and injustice, and important virtues such as kindness, cooperation, honesty and the like. Anscombe had encouraged Foote to read the works of St. Thomas Aquinas, much studied by Geach and Anscombe, both of them devout Roman Catholics. Now Foote, despite being, as she claimed, a card-carrying atheist, took much inspiration from Aquinas' discussion of the virtues, because this gave her a way of claiming an objective basis for morality. Vices are qualities which are generally bad for human beings. Virtues, qualities which human beings need or which benefit them. Grounding moral philosophy on the human virtues has a venerable history in the work of the Greek philosophers Plato and Aristotle, and Aquinas took considerable inspiration from Aristotle's treatment. Foote's appeal to virtues and vices helped her to defeat the subjectivists by showing how, unlike perhaps thin concepts such as right and good, thick concepts such as brave, kind, just and the like couldn't be deployed properly without respecting the factual constraints governing their use. They were used not merely to commend or praise or express approval, but for certain determinate types of conduct. Now we hit a problem for rationality and morality. Foote hit a problem, a well-known problem in morality, brilliantly developed by Plato in the Republic, as follows. While the virtues are generally beneficial to human beings, the most prominent of them, justice, seems to benefit others and not oneself. A society in which justice prevails is far better than a mafia-run state. And while we can wish that others possess the virtue of justice, what good to the individual himself is his own justice? This is the challenge put by Thrasymachus in Plato's Republic. Even if it's generally in one's interest to be just or brave, surely there are times when, in a tight corner, it would be better for the individual to act in a way that virtue forbids. Is it always rational to do the morally right thing? On Foote's own admission, this was a problem that she tried various unsuccessful ways to surmount until her final work. In 1972, she published a paper she later described as scandalous, entitled Morality as a System of Hypothetical Imperatives. There she argued, contrary to much moral thinking, especially in the light of the views of Immanuel Kant, that the moral course of action was rational only for the person who had a desire to follow it. Kant had argued that morality was binding on all individuals regardless of their desires, the so-called categorical imperative. But Foote, in what she later regarded as a mistaken view, argued otherwise. She turned for a while to problems in practical ethics, which I'll mention later on. But from the 80s onward, she began to see her way to an account of moral philosophy, which not only gave her the answer to subjectivism, but gave her a theory on which such an apparent conflict between morality and rationality disappears once rationality is properly understood. So now for Natural Goodness, Foote's monograph of 2001. The founding idea in this work is that moral goodness is a kind of natural goodness. What makes us good and not defective as human beings, living organisms, members of the species of Homo sapiens. Foote took a lead from the way in which we say of plants and non-human animals that they're good or defective depending on how well they're equipped with what's needed to flourish. Just as oak trees need good roots and wolves need the skills of hunting in packs, so human beings need the moral virtues of kindness, cooperation and justice, and can be called defective if they lack them. A free-riding wolf, one who eats what the pack kills but doesn't join in the hunt, is defective. And just so a human being who free rides on what the cooperation of others achieves is a defective human being. Virtues and vices are natural benefits and defects, just as swiftness in a fox and strong roots in an oak tree make them naturally good, that is, non-defective members of their species. Now, of course, as Foote acknowledges and discusses at length, human rationality makes a huge difference, and the human will complicates the picture by comparison with that of plants and non-human animals. She struggled to show that such goodness is species relative, given the great diversity of human groups, societies, and institutions. In reply, she claimed it's a benefit of her approach that it doesn't have to claim that all moral norms are the same for all human beings. But, she said, we mustn't lose sight of the fact that there are many things that are absolutely basic human needs. Given her focus on the goodness of a person as being that of a member of the human species, does her theory leave room for the goodness of individuality and of creativity? This is a question she asked and tried valiantly to answer. Foote's monograph, Natural Goodness, has been hailed as one of the most important books of moral philosophy of its time. She hoped that she had banished forever the subjectivist theories that held sway when she entered the field of philosophy in the mid-20th century, and many think she succeeded. It's been seen as part of a revolution in ethics, as bringing philosophy back to life. The trolley problem. Foote wrote some important papers in practical ethics, including one called The Problem of Abortion and the Doctrine of Double Effect, published in the Oxford Review, 1967. As you may know, the trolley problem has become a talking point outside of academic moral philosophy. She contrasted two scenarios, which we may call the magistrate and the tram driver. In the first, a magistrate arranges for an innocent man to be framed and executed in order to quell a riot in which otherwise 5 innocent men will die. He saves the lives of the 5 by ordering the death of 1. In the second scenario, the driver of a runaway tram sees that his tram is on course to kill 5 workers. He can't stop the tram, but he can divert it onto a side track where just 1 man is working. He does this and thereby saves the lives of the 5 working on the main track, but kills the 1 man on the side track. Foote wrote, "The question is why we should say without hesitation that the tram driver should steer for the less occupied track, while most of us would be appalled at the idea that the innocent man, in scenario 1, could be framed." The development of this problem and its label, the trolley problem, is due to an American philosopher, Judith Jarvis Thomson, who proposed what she called, in honour of Mrs. Foote, the trolley problem, since trams are apparently called trolleys in the US. Thomson suggested a third scenario, which we may call the transplant surgeon. A transplant surgeon saves the lives of 5 terminally ill patients by killing a patient with a broken leg and transplanting organs from the body of the deceased to save the 5 patients. Again, we may ask, why do we say without hesitation that the trolley driver should steer for the unoccupied track, while we'd be appalled if the surgeon killed one of his patients to save the lives of 5 others? What is it about the tram or trolley scenario that makes it seem permissible for the driver to act in a way that will kill 1 person in order to save the lives of 5 others, while in the other 2 scenarios, that of the magistrate and of the transplant surgeon, it's evidently quite wrong for the person in charge to kill 1 in order to save 5? Lots of answers and further elaborations of the scenarios have been offered, and I'm not going to try to adjudicate between them here. Some invoke the difference between merely foreseeing death and intending it. Others, such as Foote, invoke the difference between negative duties and positive ones. The negative duty not to kill overrides any positive duty to benefit. So the magistrate and the surgeon breach the duty not to kill. But the tram driver cannot help breaching the duty not to kill, whether he leaves it on the main track or diverts to the sidetrack. Given he cannot avoid killing, he should choose to do the least harm he can. Jarvis Thompson says the key difference is between deflecting a threat, what the trolley driver does and is permissible, and bringing a different threat to one individual to save others, which is not permissible. Other solutions are available. Here's not the place to delve deeper into this issue, but just to admire the good nose for a philosophical problem evident in Foote's celebrated example. And now I'm going to talk about Foote as an admirable human being. I'm going to end by telling you a bit about Foote as a person. She showed active kindness throughout her adult life. For instance, as a hard-working committee member of Oxfam from the 40s to the 70s, as a staunch supporter of Jewish refugees after the war, and of refugees from Hungary after the Soviet invasion in 1956. A colleague recalled finding an exhausted Philippa after long hours of teaching and college business, standing late at night at the college photocopier, printing off appeals for help for the Hungarian refugees. Years later, when her old friend Iris Murdoch suffered from dementia at the end of her life, Philippa gave unstinting love and support to Iris and her husband. The Somerville College archives contain a remarkable letter written by Philippa in 1957 to the then principal of the college, Dame Janet Vaughan, pleading with her to help find employment for her friend and colleague Elizabeth Anscombe. Anscombe had worked at Somerville, holding a variety of research fellowships and external grants for 10 years, but the funding was running out, and there was a danger that Anscombe's funding and connection with Somerville would end, with no prospect of employment elsewhere in Oxford. Over the years, Foote had borne the brunt of the teaching and organisation, while Anscombe had devoted herself to research with a modicum of teaching as and when she chose. In the letter, Foote calls her the best all-round philosopher in the university at the present time. And she wrote, "Now, Somerville is obviously the place for her, the place where she'd be happiest and where she'd have good people to teach. Anyway, there's nowhere else where she could go in Oxford, and Oxford needs her very badly." Foote went on to say, "This seems to lead to only one conclusion. Either we manage to split the job or I have to resign. But I don't want to resign. I've never wanted to resign less than at the moment when I think I've got onto a fruitful line in moral philosophy." And more, "If there's no other way out, I shall have to resign, because to stay on keeping Elizabeth out would be a thing which would leave one without a shred of self-respect." What a remarkable offer. Fortunately, the college was able to find funds to keep both philosophers in place, and a few years later I would have the great good fortune to be taught by both of them. Little did I know then of Foote's dramatic intervention to promote Anscombe, and of the deep integrity and generosity of spirit that lay behind it.